Hello guys, my name is Hugo, welcome to my channel. Today I want to talk about Canon R5C. So I want to talk about switching from Canon R5 to R5C. Probably for many people there are many questions about should you switch or should you not, because I had the same questions, and since I'm using mostly this camera for video, as well sometimes pictures, but video is the more important part, I decided to give it a try. And I came up with a list of things that I want to talk about negatives, about positives, and maybe answer some of your questions. So I'm gonna go through the exterior design changes just a little bit, so you have an understanding. So because of the fan, the body got a little bit wider, but what's cool about it that my cage from R5 fits perfectly to the same body. And what's the best part of it, probably because there is a fan, for those who know, who have for those who has a cage on R5, when you open the screen you can't tilt it. So because of this fan I can tilt the screen perfectly. I can flip it. It's like it's perfectly like it was designed for it, you know. So I love that a lot, because I found myself many times with this one having a cage, I couldn't use this screen as much as I can with this one. So that's a good thing. What sucks that they kept the micro HDMI, which is horrible. I don't know how come it can be here, because I've broken so many cables, countless amount of cables, but I've came up with solutions. So there is a small HDMI to HDMI micro, and you basically put in a cage and you squeeze it, so it basically stays here permanently. And that's another solution. So I always have a standard HDMI in case I need to hook it up to a monitor or something. So that's a decent solution in my case. So what's added is they added a timecode port, and that's really cool. And because it has fan, it has no overheating issues whatsoever. The button, instead of this button they made it red, which I also like. Interesting enough, because I was jumping from this camera to this one and I was constantly clicking on this button, the top one, to record, but it wasn't doing anything. And then I had to get used to use this button. But basically I assigned then this top button as well to record as well. And just a tip, because you can assign those buttons, there is because there is like a slow-mo mode, like in all cinema cameras of Canon. I basically assigned this button to switch to slow-mo and switch to normal mode. And this button right here, I changed it to change frame rate. And it's really convenient, because when you click on here and then you have this wheel to adjust it right away. So basically you click and adjust your slow motion speed. I found it working really well for me. So let's go first through the negatives. The negatives, first big negative to me was the autofocus is no longer the way it was in R5 in video mode. Right now it's just a standard autofocus, like in all cinema cameras, like C300 Mark III, C70, exactly the same. And I really enjoyed the autofocus in video the way it was in R5. I understand why it's happening, because they basically put two OS in the body. You have OS for photo and you have OS for video. And for video is just exactly the one that you can find in C70 or C300 Mark III, C500 Mark II. But what I was liking in the autofocus from this camera is that it was intuitive, you know. It was like AI was picking up for you what's important, and it rarely had to click on the screen to track objects because it was usually doing such a great work. Never had issues with it. With this one, it's a little bit harder. You feel the difference right away because here it's more related to faces and eye tracking, but if it's like different subjects, then you probably have to use the square in the middle, or you probably know what I mean. But what I was liking a lot in this camera is that it was intuitively picking up what's important in a shot. So that is gone, but by any means the autofocus still great in here, and unlike C70 and C300 Mark III, it has eye tracking, which is really cool, and it snaps to the eye and holds it really well. The other negative, I'm not sure if the screen brightness it's probably the same, but I put it as a negative because the screen brightness is horrible. It's really dark, and when you're outside at the bright day, you can't really see anything in here. But luckily it has a viewfinder, and the viewfinder is great because it's OLED viewfinder, great quality, and actually when you shoot you have another point of contact, so it's more stable. When I was testing this camera outside at the daytime, I used the viewfinder pretty much all the time, and I quite liked it. So another negative is there is no image stabilization, so it's gone. The moving sensor part no longer in this camera, and in a way it's negative and it's a plus, because negative is you don't have this image stabilization thing, but you still have a digital image stabilization, which works really well actually, but it doesn't have these moving parts. And what's good about it is like this camera is going to be way more reliable in terms of shake resistance. If you're going to put it or you're going to drop it or anything, because there is no moving part, it's going to survive hits way more confidently than with this camera. This camera, because there is a moving part, and actually when you move it you can feel it's something moving in there. I always had concerns about this, if you drop the camera, what's gonna happen to it. So no issues like this. And if you do some action, and quite honestly many professional filmmakers didn't like the stabilization, the sensor stabilization, because sometimes it does some kind of weird thing, you know. It can move the image sometimes in a way you don't like it. So probably it's not as bad negative as it could be, but I think it was worth mentioning. Okay, and from negatives, probably I would also add that it's eating batteries a little bit more, so it's a little bit more power hungry than this one, probably due to the fan, but it wasn't crazy like everyone was saying on YouTube that it's eating batteries like crazy. It still can probably last an hour on the battery, no problem, which comparing to other cinema cameras, it's not bad at all, considering how small this media, or how small this battery in there. And I use fan to low mode at all times, and it's quiet and it doesn't heat anything. And because of the fan, we're jumping on to the positives. So because of the fan, the camera right now is capable of filming 8K up to 60 FPS. Unlike this camera was able to record 30 FPS in 8K mode. And what's great about it, it's not like, I'm not talking about shooting 8K in this camera, because I rarely shoot 8K, and I don't know, probably all the times I shot 8K with this camera was just for testing. In real life I don't really shoot 8K on this camera, but I shoot a lot of 4K camera. And the other positive is in the R5 there is a mode called HQ. It's where it takes 8K resolution and downsample it to 4K. So that was a special mode. So there is no mode like this, because every single mode in this camera is HQ. So basically this camera takes 8K resolution and downsample it to 4K and even 2K. So absolutely everything you shoot up to 60 FPS is going to be downsampled from 8K, and it's great because the quality is incredible. Even in 2K was good in this camera, but in this camera it's just no question, it's stellar. And what's good about 8K 60 FPS is that the most used range of frame rates is up to 60 FPS, and when you shoot 4K, for instance up to 60 FPS again, you have this down sampling resolution from 8K in all this 4K up to 60 FPS, which is great. And you don't have to, like in this one you could do only up to 30 FPS in HQ mode. Codecs, that's another big plus, because this camera is famous by recording this H.265 codec, which was horrible on pretty much any computer which is not M1 chip, and I hated it because I have M1 chips on my laptop and my iPad, but my Mac Pro has an Intel processor, and it couldn't work properly, even though it's 12,000 worth computer. It wasn't working well with this codec at all. So this codec is gone. Right now we have XAVC. It's basically pretty much a standard, industry standard codec, and it works well absolutely on any system. No issues at all. I love the codec. That's great. So another thing I liked a lot in this camera, and I hated in this camera, is the control of HDMI out. So there are many shoots I didn't use this camera on multicam setups or any like professional jobs, because I couldn't control the OSD, the information on the screen when it's outputting something. Because you know this, when you're using the screen, when you go to the menu, you can see on the menu on the screen all the menu settings and all that. So if you're using this camera for a multicam setup and you're streaming, for instance, and for some reason you have to go to settings or anything, it's gonna mess up everything. So I never use this camera on like any streaming jobs at all. So in this camera, like in any other cinema cameras, you can control the HDMI out, and that's great because you can, if you like OSD, you can put it on. If you don't like OSD, you can just switch them off and have clean feed. And if you go to settings, it's not gonna mess it up. It's not gonna appear on your HDMI out. And what's good about the screen works at the same time as the output, so no issues like I had it here. That's a big plus. So with just this thing, I can actually use this on a way wider range of jobs. So the project frame rate, that's another thing that I like a lot because it's a cinema camera and it has cinema UI. You can set a project frame rate. Project frame rate means that you can set a frame rate, and if you go to slow motion mode, it's gonna convert whatever slow motion you have to the project rate. If you have 24 FPS, for instance, as a project line, like a timeline frame rate, it's gonna convert everything to this frame rate. Very useful thing, as well as the shutter angle. In the frame rates, unlike in this camera, you're very limited in terms of choosing what kind of frame rates you can do in slow motion, and in this there is a wide range going from like time-lapse to almost variation, different kind of variation frame rates you want. If you want like 48, 40, 36, you can do in this camera, which is great as well because I'm not always shooting 60 FPS. Sometimes I want 48, sometimes I want 40, or maybe even less, like 36, if I want to be not too slow, but I want to be just give it a little bit, like it's used a lot in commercials, you know, when you want just to give a little bit of slowing movement. And then the shutter angle is great. It has the shutter angle, so I didn't like the that this camera didn't have shutter angle, because sometimes I was switching from 24 fps to 60 fps and I forgot to change my shutter speed, and then I open files on my computer and I see all this jittering effect, and it was just horrible, not usable footage. I had to do some anything. You've probably been in this situation. So in this way, you no longer have this when you have a shutter angle, because shutter angle is gonna stay constantly, and no matter whether you switch into slow-mo or real time, it's gonna stay permanently in whatever settings you set, and that is great too. Timecode. Timecode is another big addition to this camera, because again, I didn't use this camera much in the multicam shoots, because when I use multicam shoots I prefer to jam timecode in all the cameras, and I couldn't do this with this camera. So with this camera now I can jam it timecode, and not only jam it, unlike many other cameras, it can also generate timecode. So for instance, many other cameras, like even Alexa, Red cameras, they only can receive timecode, they cannot generate. So this camera can generate timecode. So basically, before I had to use a timecode generator or like a sound device or something, you know, to generate timecode. Right now I can just take this camera and jam it to any other cameras on set to make the same timecode, which is, I believe it's a cool thing as well, because now I can use one less device, you know, for jamming. And it uses this, I don't know what's the standard, it's like mini SDI or micro SDI to SDI. I bought this cable from Amazon for like 12 bucks or something, so cheap, easy to find. So picture profiles. So there is a wider range of picture profiles, and it also has, besides just the standard log and C-Log and C-Log 3, and it doesn't have C-Log 2, unfortunately. You can use C-Log 2 only in RAW when you shoot 8K. Then you gain access to C-Log 2. But unfortunately in any other modes you don't have C-Log 2, but you have C-Log 3, and what's good about it, you have C-Log 3 Cine Gamma, which this camera doesn't have. This camera has only Rec. 709 C-Log 3. This camera has Rec. 709 C-Log 3 and the Cine Gamma, and Cine Gamma, to my personal opinion, is way nicer than just Rec. 709 one. It gives more flexibility. And also what it has YDR mode, and I loved YDR in any other Canon cameras, cinema cameras, because it's basically a codec that very often you don't need to send to your client log files, because very often they don't know what to do with them, and they just want straight out of the camera a nice image. And YDR was the profile that always looked incredible straight out of the camera, because it was holding the dynamic range well, but it also was giving really nice colors and contrast. So I loved using YDR in any previous cameras, cinema cameras from Canon before, and I love seeing YDR in this camera as well. And then in terms of picture profiles, there are settings, deep settings where you can control noise reduction, which is pretty cool, because it helps you denoise your image when you go to higher ISO. And actually I set it up to medium settings, and in medium settings it works pretty well to me. You don't really see much this noise reduction working unless you push in your ISO to very high ISO. So if you like seeing a very clean image without noise, you can play with those settings, and I found myself using medium noise reduction settings at all times, because looks really good. Next, it has false color. Beside other waveform and zebra, it has a false color, which is a good addition to see in the cinema camera because I like false color more than other tools. Another thing, it has dual ISO, and overall I want to talk about like interesting that by the way, I want to say about dynamic range because I've seen people saying that dynamic range is higher on this camera than on this camera. Honestly, in my tests, when I tested, I didn't see any difference specifically in dynamic range. Dynamic range looked identical from these both cameras. I tried in the different tests and high ISO, low ISO, all kind of conditions. I don't see any gain in dynamic range in this camera at all. But what I see is the noise structure is very different. I absolutely hated the noise structure, the noise flow on this camera. Even though it's not a noisy camera at all, but the noise was so digital and so colorful, you know. It was, every time I saw the noise from this camera, I didn't like it a lot. In this camera, the noise structure of the floor, it's like absolutely different camera. The noise is very subtle and it's very monochromic. It looks way more like a grain. It looks more like in the other cinema cameras, you know, the way it looks, it feels like it's the same was in C300 Mark III, C70, this kind of noise, you know, not ugly digital noise like in this one. Way nicer noise flow. And the dual ISO, at first I thought it's a gimmick because I felt like 3200 ISO on this camera is still pretty good, but it's significantly nicer in this one, and you actually can see the difference. So 800 and the 3200 ISO in this one, very similar in terms of noise flow. So it's a great addition to see in this camera. And another positive is the dual recorder. So I can do dual recording in this camera using CF Express and SD card. So I can have a backup on my other card, which is also a great thing when you do some important jobs. You want to have a backup. You want to have 2 channels of recording, or if you want to do proxy as well. So that's another thing great to have, unlike I couldn't do in this camera as well. So that's, I think, pretty much it. And as you can see, there are many positives and very little negatives about this camera. And going through all these positives, it wasn't a brainer for me at all to pay 1,000 extra for this camera over R5, because it gives you so much more professional tools if you do video work primarily. So I decided to sell my R5 and get this camera, and I feel like I'm gonna be liking this camera a lot more than I loved this one, and I love this camera a lot. I hope I answered some of your questions, and I hope I helped you to figure out if it's worth or not worth it upgrade from R5. Please hit like, subscribe button. It really helps me and motivates me to do more videos like this. I hope this information was useful for you. Thank you for your time. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.